get going in a minute. We're letting people in and getting the tech in order.
You're good, Amy.
All right. Actually, what that means is, David, go for it.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm David Blair. I'm very happy to welcome you to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series tonight, Monday, June 16th. Our topic tonight is Fierce Vulnerability for Nonviolent Social Change with Kazu Haga. I first met, so to speak, Kazu when I was at the Boston University School of Theology writing my final paper on nonviolence, and I read his wonderful book, Healing Resistance. We'll be hearing tonight from him about another book. I also learned that Kazu briefly was a resident of Peterborough, New Hampshire, because he was a freshman at Conval High School, which is wonderful coincidence. So, for over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all, based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we are doing our work on Indakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the Almobak, the people who have stewarded Indakina throughout the generations. We'd like to give you a quick reminder on our Zoom guidelines. We love it when you keep your video on, but we will keep your audio muted to start with. You can use the chat to ask questions, and later we'll do hand raising after Kazu's finished speaking. Kazu Haga is a trainer and practitioner of nonviolence and restorative justice with over 25 years of experience in nonviolence and social change work. He's the author of Healing Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm, and of Fierce Vulnerability, Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. He works with incarcerated people, youth, and activists from around the country. He joins us today from the Canticle Farm community on Lisjan Ohlone land in Oakland, California, where he lives with his family. Please join me in welcoming Kazu.
Thank you so much, David, and everyone at New Hampshire Peace Action. Really grateful to be here. Good evening, afternoon for me. I'm calling from California. Yeah, it was really cool to find out that David is currently in Peterborough, New Hampshire. The chances, just a small little town, but yeah, I spent my freshman year of high school there and grew up in New England, mostly in Massachusetts. So being in connection with folks in the New England area really feels like home. Still got my Celtics hat on despite the uh, the challenging news that we've had over the last couple of months as Celtics fans. But yeah, really grateful to be here. I'm really grateful to have a chance to talk about some of the stuff that's been moving through my heart and moving through my mind. I'll just share very briefly this idea of fierce vulnerability emerged between a conversation that my friend Chris Moore-Backman, who is the author of another book called The Gandhian Iceberg, was a Gandhian nonviolence trainer. My friend Chris and I had this conversation for many years about the word nonviolence. We're both nonviolence trainers, lifelong committed nonviolence practitioners. And we also realize that there's so many misunderstandings about the word nonviolence. People think nonviolence is about being passive, it is about being weak, it's about thinking that if all we need to do is love our enemies, somehow that love alone will magically transform unjust systems. And because of these misunderstandings, the word nonviolence has almost become a dirty word in a lot of communities, particularly around young people and marginalized communities. And so for many years, we were having this conversation about let's find a different word. Let's find a new word. And once people are in the door, then we can have a conversation about this thing that is so meaningful for us. But in terms of marketing and almost we kind of like need to rebrand nonviolence, And this conversation went on for years, trying to find the next word. And we came upon this term fierce vulnerability at a protest that Chris was at. And it kind of stuck with us. And ultimately, we decided to continue to use the word nonviolence because we realized that the word nonviolence ties us to a legacy and a lineage that is so important that we didn't want to lose. But the words fierce vulnerability just kept moving through our hearts and it kept teaching us things. And so, what is a couple of trainers to do but design a workshop called Fierce Vulnerability? And we designed a 2-day workshop called Fierce Vulnerability. Didn't really know what we were talking about, but we had this powerful conversation with a group of 30 people and it took off and it kind of took on a life of its own and it became the book that I wrote that came out earlier this year in March. It's the name of a national network called the Fierce Vulnerability Network. And in some ways, there's nothing new about it, right? The ancient lineage of nonviolence has been around as long as violence has been around, as long as people, human beings, our ancestors have been resisting violence. And we believe that there are new threads that we are weaving into this lineage. Specifically, we view fierce vulnerability as the intersection of spiritual practice, very broadly defined, the ancient lineage of nonviolence, and some of the newer sciences that we have access to in my generation around trauma healing modalities, and various therapeutic modalities to help us heal through both personal and ancestral wounds. And so I'll share just a couple of general thoughts about what fierce vulnerability is, and then would love to open it up to you all and for questions, discussions, responses. So let me just share my slide here. And I want to start the story of fierce vulnerability with this picture. This was a gathering that I went to in 2012. And this was around the time when I just started to explore my own trauma healing journey, realizing that a lot of the violence that I held was actually internal in my own heart because of a lot of the unhealed trauma that I had from childhood. And right around that time, I started to become aware that a lot of my childhood experiences, I came from a home that had a lot of violence. And in fact, the year that I lived in New Hampshire was a really difficult time for me. And I had, for the longest time, been telling myself the story that, oh, this was a really difficult time. But these were experiences that happened in my childhood. It happened 20 years ago. I'm over it. I moved on. But even though I've been telling myself this story for some time, I started to become aware that I still had a lot of pain, a lot of shame that emerged from these childhood experiences. And so when I was 22 years old, however old I was in 2012, I went to this week-long experience called a jam. And jams are these week-long transformative experiences for social change makers. And people were sharing really deeply vulnerable personal stories. And so I decided to share my own personal story from childhood, thinking that, it was something that I experienced 20 years ago. It's not that big of a deal. And the moment I started to talk about it, I went into complete panic. And I was crying and crying, and I could barely breathe, never mind find the right words to say. And I realized in that moment how delusional I was, telling myself that these traumatic experiences, the so much violence that I experienced and witnessed as a kid, that because it had been 20 years, I'm over it. That somehow I'd healed, even though I never actually processed it. I never actually looked at it. And over the years, I realized that this is the same dynamic that is happening in our country where in our country, the United States, we say things like, oh, slavery was hundreds of years ago, we're over it, we've healed that wound. Or the genocide of indigenous peoples, the indentured servant, the servitude of even European peoples, those were difficult times, but it's been hundreds of years and we've moved on. And I realized that in the same way that trauma was alive in my body from early childhood, the collective trauma of our shared experiences are stuck and frozen in our collective bodies. And until we're able to talk about these issues and to begin the process of healing from them, that we would never be whole as a collective, as a nation, as a species, as a people. And so that's a little bit of what fierce vulnerability is about. It's about how we take the lessons learned from the journey of healing personal traumas and extrapolate them to scale within a context of a world that is falling apart. And so one of the main theories in fierce vulnerability is this idea that the universe is built on fractals. And fractals are this geometric pattern that repeats itself over and over again, right? So no matter how small of a scale of something you zoom into, or how large of a scale you zoom out to, because the pattern repeats itself over and over and over again, it looks the same. And there's many examples of fractals in nature, from Romanesco broccoli to the Nautilus seashell. Another example of fractals might be what's called a dust devil. When hot air mixes with cool air, it creates these little tiny tornadoes that you oftentimes see as you're driving down driving down the street in a dry climate. We take the science of what creates dust devils and zoom up a level on the fractal, and we see that tornadoes create the same shape, the same pattern, but just at a much larger scale. And if we keep zooming out, you see that the eye of a hurricane actually creates much the same pattern because of the same physics, right? And if we keep zooming out, you also see how planets rotate around its sun. And then you keep zooming out in the fractal, and you see how a galaxy rotates around the center of its axis. And no matter how small the scale or how large the scale, because the universe is built on fractals, we keep seeing the same patterns repeat over and over and over again. And why am I talking about this? It's because at some point I realized that we have a family member who has a lot of unhealed trauma from their childhood that they've never had the opportunities to really look at, to be supported through, to be witnessed in, and to heal from. And so it feels like their life is a constant state of crisis, right? We'll spend months supporting them in their relationship with their kids. And then at some point, that'll get better. But then a couple of months later, they'll be in a crisis in their relationship with their partner. And then that gets better. And then a couple of months later, they're in a crisis with their career. And it felt like we were playing this never-ending game of whack-a-mole. And I realized at some point that we were playing a never-ending game of whack-a-mole because this person has a deep core trauma, a core wounding from childhood. And until we're able to help that person deal with and integrate their core wounding, we were just dealing with surface level manifestations of a much deeper wound. And if we take this idea of core trauma and zoom out a level of the fractal, I used to work with a nonprofit organization here in the Bay Area in California that used to do incredible work supporting marginalized communities in moving through their traumatic experiences. But even though the external facing work of this organization was really powerful, for some reason, the organization was in a constant state of crisis. There were always conflicts. Volunteers would be leaving. Staff would quit and file lawsuits against the board. There were accusations of improper use of funds. The directors would make organizations that would impact the volunteers without consulting them at all. And it felt like we were playing this never-ending game of whack-a-mole. And I realized at some point that, again, we were playing this never-ending game of whack-a-mole because this organization, as a collective body, had core trauma. I realized that 30 years prior to me being there, the founders of the organization brought with them some really unhealthy organizational practices. They had a tendency to make decisions that would impact people on the ground without consulting them. They had a tendency to feel like they were good progressive people. So racism and sexism and these things didn't apply in their organizations. So they refused to talk about these difficult power dynamics that were playing out within the organization. And all of these unhealthy, toxic organizational practices became adopted as the organizational culture. And so now, 20 years, 30 years later, None of those individuals were around anymore, but those practices became stuck as the core trauma and became stuck as the organizational culture. And so now, 30 years later, we were playing this never-ending game of whack-a-mole because there was a much deeper wound that the organization collectively would not were not addressing. And so now if we zoom out one more level on the fractal, and again, look at this nation state that we call the United States. We are never in a shortage of crises, right? We all know this, whether it's mental health or policing or education or healthcare or LGBT rights. We are in a constant state of crisis. And even if we're winning incremental changes on legislation, we take a step back and look at the big picture, and it just feels like we are playing this never-ending game of whack-a-mole, and we're just spinning in circles. And I feel like there's a similar dynamic that is happening, that this country, our collective nation state, our collective body experienced really traumatic things in our early childhood, right? In the early childhood, in the beginnings of our nation state, we experienced things like genocide and enslavement. And collectively, we can't go through such traumatic experiences and not have that leave a deep, deep imprint on our bodies, that if we're not able to process and release, it gets frozen in our collective identity, right? And so now, every time we try to talk about racial healing, we go into a state of panic, much like my body went into a state of panic when I first started to talk about my childhood trauma, right? Because I had been living in this delusion for decades that, oh, my childhood trauma 20 years ago, I've gotten over it. And because our country continues to say, oh, our childhood traumas, enslavement, genocide, hundreds of years ago, we've gotten over it, we've moved on. And because we are stuck in this delusion, every time we even try to talk about reparations or racial healing or land back, our country seems to go into a state of panic. I've been using this word trauma a lot, right? So I just want to slow down a little bit and talk a little bit about what my understanding of trauma is. Trauma is when you experience something so scary, so life-threatening, that the feelings associated with that fear, the shame, the isolation, those feelings are so scary that as a survival mechanism, our body shuts down and represses those feelings so we don't have to feel them in that moment, right? Our body acknowledges that it's too much for me to feel that fear, to feel that shame while I'm fending off the attack. And so it represses those feelings deep into our bodies. And if we're not able to find healthy ways to release and integrate those feelings, they get frozen, they get stuck in our bodies. And so now 20 years, 30 years, 500 years later, when there are things that trigger that traumatic memory, it's not just the memory of the story of what happened to us, it's the feelings that come back, the feelings of fear, the feelings of shame. And our body can't tell the difference between what's happening now and what happened 30 years ago or what happened 500 years ago, right? There's a difference between a traumatic memory and a stressful memory. If you're having a stressful memory, you remember the story of what happened. But if you're having a traumatic response, you're also remembering the feeling of what it was like in your body when you experienced that initial trigger. And when you're having a traumatic response, we know through science now that there's a part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. When you're having a traumatic response, the prefrontal cortex literally gets disabled on a physiological level. There's a part of our brain called the amygdala. It's the emotional center of our brain. It takes over our brain, and we lose our ability to think about logic. We lose our ability to take in different information, integrate opposing perspectives. Our mind goes into a binary where everything is black and white, everything is right and wrong. And there's also something that happens in our bodies. A part of our nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and it puts our body into a fight or flight response. It pumps adrenaline and cortisol throughout our entire bodies. It increases our heart rate, our pupils dilate, and all of these are survival mechanisms, right? Our bodies increase heart rate so that it can pump more blood throughout our bodies, so it can carry more oxygen to our bodies. Our pupils dilate so it can see threats better. We lose our ability to think about logic and rationale because the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is capable of thinking about logic requires a lot of energy. So our brain sends all of the energy that is available to us to the parts of our brain that is responsible for immediate survival, right? Like if you're running away from a saber-toothed tiger, you don't need to think about logic, right? There's no nuance in that situation. So the part of our brain that is capable of thinking about nuance shuts down. So essentially what happens when we go into a trauma response is that our capacity for nonviolence gets cut off. The part of our brain that is capable of thinking about and practicing nonviolence is physiologically not available to us, right? The part of our brain that is capable of thinking about nuance, that is capable of considering another person's perspective, that is capable of thinking about concepts like interdependence, that is not available to us. And so, in this time of such traumatic triggers, whether it's climate catastrophe or genocide or war, pandemics, it becomes harder and harder for us to practice nonviolence if we are not also practicing the things that help us stay grounded and stay connected to our higher selves, that prefrontal cortex, whether it is short-term strategies like emotional regulation or long-term strategies like meditation and trauma healing work. If we're not practicing these things in the face of so many traumatic triggers, it's so easy for us to lose our capacity to practice nonviolence. And one of the main theories, again, in fierce vulnerability is this idea that injustice is not a political issue, that injustice is actually a manifestation of our collective trauma. And if we can understand injustice less as a political issue and more as a manifestation of collective trauma, then can we build movements that not only lead with this energy of we're here to shut things down? A lot of activist spaces that I've been a part of move with this energy of we're here to shut things down. But we know through work in trauma science that you can't go to groups of traumatized people or people acting out of their trauma and wave our fingers and point to them and say, you are wrong, you are a bad person, you need to stop doing that, right? What you need to do when someone is operating from their traumatic response is create space to open things up, right? To open up stories, to open up possibilities for connection, to open up space for vulnerability. And the last thing that I want to share before I open it up for questions and conversation is, as many of you know, some of the David and others were sharing that you work with the Albert Einstein Institute. And a lot of these organizations that have been teaching nonviolence for so long teaches us that as the violence in our society escalates, we need to escalate our nonviolent response to that harm, right? So if you're responding to a low intensity level of conflict, you can go to someone and say, hey, everything's going to be fine. Just take a deep breath, right? That's a perfectly appropriate response to a low intensity level of conflict. And if we zoom out a level of the fractal, and if you're responding to a low intensity level of social conflict, filling out a petition might be the perfectly appropriate response, right? But as the violence escalates, we have to escalate our response to that violence. And so if two people are fighting, you might need to like pull them apart using force, right? That becomes the more appropriate response because the violence is more escalated. Someone breaking down a door and entering a house without consent might feel like a really escalated thing to do. But if they're responding to a burning building, it might feel like the appropriate response. And this is also why the movement for Black Lives have never filled out a petition drive, because the level of violence that the movement for Black Lives is responding to is so escalated, right? Centuries and centuries of state violence against Black people, that shutting down a highway or taking over a bridge might feel like the more appropriate response. But one of the things that I've noticed in my life so when this picture was taken, I actually took this picture. I was at this action when, as part of the movement for Black Lives, we shut down the San Francisco Bay Bridge, a bridge that gets like, I think like 500,000 people cross the bridge every day. Um, and on Martin Luther King Day, in the name of Black Lives, we shut that bridge down. It was a very escalated response to an escalated harm. But even in these actions, I've noticed that one of the things that happens is that the more we escalate the tactics that we use, the more we start to do things like shutting down a highway, the more we tend to escalate polarization. The more we tend to escalate this binary worldview of us versus them. And my fear is that this binary view of them and us, right and wrong, is at the heart of what is destroying our planet. And I also know that the binary worldview where everything becomes black and white, everything becomes fractured, is also a traumatic response, right? So a lot of the work of fierce vulnerability is about understanding how we can have escalated responses to some of the most escalated forms of violence we have ever experienced as a species, right? If you look at climate, um, while also doubling down on connection, doubling down on the commitment to healing of relationship, of reconciliation. This is an escalated response to an escalated harm. I've been to protests that look like this 100 times. And I'm not saying that these protesters are doing anything wrong. I'm not saying that these protesters are bad. They're right. Um, what I am saying is that when I imagine myself at this protest, if I really take in this image and I imagine myself in this scene and I check in and notice what happens in my body tightens, right? My muscles tighten. I might even notice my heart rate escalating. I notice things that are signs of a traumatic response, right? I begin to shut down. And if we zoom into this image and look for an image that might be analogous to this image at the interpersonal level, it might look like this, a boss arguing with his employee, right? It's very clear that two sides have been drawn. It's us versus them. There's no listening. There's no dialogue. Um, it's not a scene that feels conducive to healing. And at the same time, I look at this image. Many of you have seen this image before. It went viral. It won the Pulitzer Prize. This is an image of a young mother named Aisha Evans, who was at a Black Lives Matter protest after the police murder of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, years ago. It's also an escalated response to an escalated harm. She's also practicing civil disobedience, shutting down a public roadway. And yet, when I look at this image and I imagine myself there, if I even imagine myself as Aisha, and I notice what happens in my body, something different happens, right? There isn't the sense of I'm here to shut things down. I notice myself slowing down. I notice more spaciousness available in my body. And in fact, there's an interview with Aisha after this photo went viral. And the interviewer asked her, like, what was going on in your mind when this picture was taken? And she said, my mind was filled with curiosity. I wonder what it's like to be these police officers. Like, I wonder what's going on in their minds. How can they do this and sleep at night? And I know from my work in trauma science that when you're operating from a traumatic response, curiosity is not available to you. Like the curiosity about like, oh, I wonder how the other person in this conflict is experiencing this conflict is not something that you're capable of even considering if you're in a traumatic response. And so it tells me that even though Aisha was responding to extreme violence, that she was able to do it in a way that was grounded, that was slow, and that remained open to curiosity. And if we look for an image at the interpersonal level that might be analogous to this, if we zoom in on the fractal, it might look like this dialogue that happened between Donald Lacey, the man on the left, a resident of Oakland who lost his daughter to homicide many years ago, and the man on the right who's currently serving a life sentence in San Quentin State Prison for having murdered his daughter. And they came together because they were ready to have a healing dialogue. And that is also an escalated response. It takes months of planning to an escalated form of violence. But at the interpersonal level, they were able to both notice that they wanted to open things up. They wanted to open up this conversation that could potentially lead them to healing. And so to me, that is the work of fierce vulnerability, is taking these lessons that we've learned from my own trauma healing journey, what I've witnessed in dialogues that I've had the privilege to facilitate dialogues between incarcerated people and the people that they've harmed, or the parents of the people that they've taken their lives, and seen so much magic and healing happen, and just wondering what it would be like to extrapolate those lessons and to really look at resistance work as a modality of collective trauma healing. Right? Like nonviolence work forever has been about healing and reconciliation as the ultimate goal. But the science of trauma healing is newer. Like Dr. King didn't have access to understanding our neurobiology while we're experiencing harm. And so I think science of trauma healing, the different modalities that we have around it, can give us so much more if we're trying to build movements that move towards healing and towards reconciliation. So a lot of the work of fierce vulnerability is about understanding, like, all right, if we understand injustice as a sign of collective trauma, and our work is trying to bring healing to larger and larger scales, then what do we need to do in our own movements to prepare ourselves to play that kind of role in public spaces? So I have a lot more questions than I have answers. But I'm excited to kind of get into this conversation and yeah, just figure things out together. So I'll pause there, and I'll turn it back to David. And I know we're gonna have about a half hour for his conversations with everyone.
Thank you, Kazu. It's so fascinating how you brought together two fields that do need each other. Um, I think your first book that I read, Healing Resistance, I remember that more as taking me deep into Kingian nonviolence. And now what you've been saying about trauma reminds me of another book I read at that time, My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, which is about the deep-seated trauma, often of white people whose ancestors perpetrated uh, genocide and slavery and who are also suffering that trauma. Your description at the end of Aisha's stance reminded me of what we sometimes talk about in nonviolence training. It's a gesture that Barbara Deming sort of popular. Thank you. Could you make that and just make that, explain it, and then we'll open it up to questions.
It's one of my favorite kind of descriptions of nonviolence. I think it's so powerful. So Barbara Deming was an activist in the 60s and 70s that wrote kind of an essay called "Revolution on Revolution and Equilibrium." And there's a short section of that essay that's become known as the two hands of nonviolence, where she says the practitioner of nonviolence raises one hand, and with this hand we say no. We say no to the violence. We refuse to pay for the guns. We refuse to pay for the walls. With this hand, I will even disrupt the easy pattern of your life. And that is the realm of civil disobedience and protests and nonviolent action. But she also says, but the nonviolent practitioner also extends the other hand, and the other hand is always extended outwards. And she says, sometimes with sympathy and compassion, sometimes not, but always stretched outwards. And with this hand, we say, and we will never cast you out of the human race. We will never give up on your dignity as a human being. I know you can make better choices than you're making now, and I will be here for you when you are ready. And it's when we can practice these two hands together that really brings the transformative power of nonviolence. So yeah, thanks for bringing that in.
Thank you, Kazu. It's funny that when you raised your hand raised on the screen. So, Amy and Doreen, do you have questions that you see in the chat that you would like to cite?
There are not yet questions, though there are a couple of comments, and one is a quote that Arnie has pasted in where, Arnie, I'm interested in unmuting you to go ahead and read it. There you are. Hold on. Do you mind doing that?
Just more Barbara Deming. We could put more pressure on the antagonist for whom we show human concern. It is precisely solicitude for his person, in combination with a stubborn interference with his actions, that can give us a very special degree of control precisely in our acting both with love, if you will, in the sense that we respect his human rights and truthfulness, in the sense that we act out fully our objections to his violating our rights. We put upon him two pressures: the pressure of our defiance of him and the pressure of our respect for his life. And it happens that in combination, these two pressures are uniquely effective.
Thank you, Arnie. Barbara Harrison, I see your hand is up.
Oh, I don't see. Oh, okay. Yeah, I've
Okay, I'm trying.
you
Ask-
can't. Oh yeah, actually you can, David. You
I
Okay.
did.
just wanted to comment on this training through the Women's March that I had gone to the other night using the OODA loop, which is decision-making model that describes the process of observing, orienting, deciding, and then acting. And also it emphasizes speed and adaptability. So it just, I can't remember the name of the person, I'm sorry, who just spoke very expressively about trauma. So what he was saying reminded me a little bit of this lecture the other night, and I can't remember the name of the person who's trained in this. So that was all. I just wanted to comment, and I'm glad I chose to come here to this webinar rather than go to the other one that I was going to go to on China. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Barbara. And I'm glad that you're
Kazu, is it your name
Yes,
is
Kazu.
Kazu?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm
So
glad you got to do some trainings because training is such an important part of this work. So
right, and learning how to think through and not just rush in, to a decision, and also thinking when someone else is in a negative position, how you can best take care of them, so to speak, so that they're not injured and that things survive in a positive way. Thank you, Kazu.
thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Kevin Blanchette's hand is up. Amy?
Hi, this has been such a fascinating perspective on all of this and like the history of the United States and how it has led us here. Thank you so much for that. I am curious with the idea of I really like the idea of shutting down versus opening up, and we want to be moving people towards opening up. A lot of people experience so much pain that they're really stuck in the things need to be shut down. How do you generally have open conversations with people to help them help them open up before they go to protest, things like that, and recognize the benefits of opening up? How do you work on that, like pre-protest with people?
Yeah, a couple of things I'd love to share on that is one of the things that the Fierce Vulnerability Network is really emphasizing is building relationships with small groups of people where we can do a lot of the healing work, a lot of the grief work, a lot of the rage work, so that by the time we get to the protest, we've already been building and we've already been doing that deepening work because it takes so long and requires really tight containers to be doing that work. There's a beautiful quote that comes from Reverend Nadia Bowles-Weber, who says, "Preach from your scars, not from your wounds." And so a lot of the internal practices of the Fierce Vulnerability Network is about taking the things that, like the vulnerable truths that we might want to lead with in our protests and processing it and building scars around it so that when we get to the protest, we can lead with our vulnerability and still have some layer of protection around it. I oftentimes think about how different it would be if we led in our demonstrations with messages not of we demand this legislation or you are wrong or like shut this down, but instead led with messages of we are here because our hearts are breaking when we witness the violence that is happening in our communities. And that's a vulnerable thing, right? Like, but if we can process that enough in our groups before we get to the protest, then maybe we can lead with that vulnerability and still stay protected in some way. And that's really important because in all of the work I've done, I do a lot of work with incarcerated people, and particularly with incarcerated men. They've received messages for decades that vulnerability is not welcome. And in fact, vulnerability can like it can be they could be risking their lives if they share vulnerably in a group or something. And so to open up vulnerability in a group like that when people are so shut down, I've noticed like the power of when one person models vulnerability, it just immediately creates more space for people to step into their own vulnerability. And so our hope is that if we as movements can do our internal healing work enough so that we can lead with our vulnerability when we're out there in the world, then maybe our vulnerability can open up the hearts of other people who are so shut down. And that might be like planting a seed of curiosity in a police officer, or it might be like opening up seeds of curiosity in other protesters who are used to being out there yelling and shutting things down. But the more small pockets of activists who are engaged in this kind of work, our hope is that it can have ripple effects and begin to shift the culture of activism little by little. Thank you.
Kazu, when you speak of leading with vulnerability, I'm thinking of the acronym we use in peacekeeping training called CLARA.
Oh, yeah.
Center and listen before you act. And that centering, would I'm thinking that leading with centeredness and calmness, which comes from having done some of that inner work, is rather similar to leading from vulnerability. That is, if we at a demonstration are clearly grounded, however we got there, that will have an effect on others. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, because we all have mirror neurons, right? Like we know that when there's tense conflict even between two people, like if someone steps into that conflict with really slow grounded energy, that can have an impact on the two people that are in conflict, or vice versa. If like there's a really tense conflict between two people and I'm not grounded and I walk into that conflict, I'm going to be moved by that energy and that tension, and I'm going to start to deregulate and escalate, right? And so this there's another quote that I love that comes from an ancient Greek poet who says, "We don't rise to the level of expectation, we fall to the level of our training." And so we can have all these wonderful expectations about like when we're at a protest or next time I'm mediating a conflict between my friends, I'm going to stay grounded, I'm going to stay centered, I'm going to stay slow. But if we haven't been trained in that, like if we haven't been practicing, then it's very easy that our emotions are going to get kind of inspired, if you will, by the energy in the space. And so it's really important for us to be doing the practice over and over and over again so that we can really stay grounded in moments of tension.
Roy J. has his hand up, Amy.
Oh, Roy, you're still there. You go.
I just am wondering how one can engage rationally with a person who's being controlled by their amygdala.
Don't. When someone is being controlled by their amygdala, it's like a lower part. I don't want to say lower, but it's a less evolved part of our brain, right? It's an older part of our brain. The part of our brain that is capable of rational thinking is not available to them. So if you try to argue with someone rationally who's in a traumatic response, it will do you no good. What you can do is use a bottom-up approach and perhaps have them connect with their body somatically in some way. If this is a person that you know and you feel comfortable with, you can try, like, can I hold your hand and squeeze your hand? Can I give you a hug? Can you take a deep breath with me? Can you name some colors that you see? Can you name what's around? I see a window. I see a wicker basket. These are all things that help people re-engage their sympathetic nervous system and the prefrontal cortex. You can have them take a sip of water or take a snack. One of the things that happens when our emotions are dysregulated, when we go into our panic, is our digestive system gets shut down. So you can reverse that by eating something, swallowing something that kicks in our digestive system, and then it can have ripple effects. And I'll also share that, when people are operating from their amygdala, they're not able to take in information, right? So a really well-poised question can have them start to try to like introspect and reconnect with their own brain. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is I have an aunt who used to be my favorite aunt. She was my favorite. She was like my hippie aunt growing up. And over the last 10 years, she's become a climate change denying Trump supporter, which is a path that many people have taken, right? To become go from like lefty, hippie, spiritual people to these Trump supporters. And when I talk to my mom, when I talk to my other aunts about her, they're basically all like, "Oh, forget her. She's a lost cause. Don't engage with her." And that makes me really sad because she used to be my favorite aunt. And nonviolence is always about engagement, and nonviolence is about speaking truth. And so when I think about engaging with her, it's like, all right, what is a truth that I can communicate to her? The first truth that always emerges in my mind is the truth that your understanding of climate data is wrong. And let me show you the 100 ways that you are wrong. And that is true. Like, I do think that her understanding of climate science is wrong. And I can imagine the impact that that would have on our relationship, right? And the conversation. But if I look carefully, there's a deeper, more vulnerable truth that sounds something more like, you used to be my favorite aunt, and I mourn the relationship that we don't have. And I'm concerned that you are losing relationships with my mom and your other sisters, and you don't seem to care. And I'm wondering, like, what's going on for you? How are you doing? And a question like that might be just enough of a relational connection that might re-engage with the higher parts of herself. Then a dialogue can really happen. But if I try to argue with her rationally, it's never going to work, right? So yeah, perhaps some deeper truth, a question that opens somebody up.
Thanks, Kazu. Aro Veno has his hand up, or her.
Yes. Thank you, Kazu. I really resonate with your perspectives. And I wonder if it might be possible to, and if it is possible, if it would be beneficial for us to sometimes demonstrate in silence, without signs, without speakers, just with a calm presence, and not include any song.
Yeah. 100%. I have been part of several silent demonstrations and silent marches. Most recently, it's sad that this was most recent, and it was years ago at Standing Rock, when a group of Indigenous women led a silent march to the police line. I think there's something so powerful about silence, and there's a story. This is actually the protest in which the words "fierce vulnerability" emerged. I wasn't there, but my friend Chris that I mentioned was. He was at this action that was part of a campaign to try to stop the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline on the East Coast, another pipeline that was going through marginalized communities. And the night before the protest, they asked themselves, the activists, they asked, what are the qualities that we long to see in this demonstration tomorrow? And so they mentioned things like healing and reconciliation and vulnerability and all these things. And so out of that, they committed to not holding signs and not doing any chants during the whole action. And so they were like, what are you going to do at an action if you're not holding signs and chanting? That's what we're supposed to do, right? And so instead, they occupied the governor's mansion. They sat in a circle in the lobby of the governor's mansion and refused to leave until they were arrested. And they sat in silence, they prayed, they sang songs, and at some point the lieutenant governor came down. They invited the lieutenant governor to sit in circle with them, and each person went around sharing vulnerably, many of them being brought to tears, why they were there and why the construction of this pipeline is so scary for them. And they said by the end of the circle, the lieutenant governor was also weeping and was so grateful that like these protesters were there. And eventually they all got arrested, and apparently one of the police officers, as he was arresting the protesters, said to one of the protesters, "Thank you so much for your hospitality." Like the police officer was thanking the protester for their hospitality as he was arresting them for refusing to leave the governor's mansion. And so, yeah, like could silence, could sharing our stories, could sharing our vulnerability be actually more powerful than the typical ways that we protest by chanting and holding signs? I really think it can. So, absolutely. Yeah.
I have a comment in the chat that I'd like to highlight, because I think there's something interesting here. I think it's Bree wrote, this is eye-opening, and I really appreciate the opportunity to learn about this work. The silly part of me is wondering if my next protest sign should be, let's all get therapy. So I think that brings up kind of the idea of, does this mean everyone goes home and does their own work? Or I think what you're asking us is to bring this into our together spaces. But I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's a yes and. I love therapy, individual therapy, but particularly modalities like internal family systems. And I'm doing a workshop on a modality called family constellations this weekend. I'm really excited about. Um, and I know that therapy is not accessible to everybody. It's really really expensive. And also, as much as I love therapy and I will always be an advocate for individual mental health, um, there is a limitation to it. I once heard a movement for Black Lives leader say that we are taught to heal collective wounds individually. Like these are all like so much of our trauma, especially if you come from marginalized identities, come from systemic injustice, patriarchy, white supremacy, poverty, all of these things. And we're taught that we can go into a windowless room with one other individual and talk about my experience and my brain and my childhood without it being in relationship with all of the systems that actually harm me. And so I really do believe in the importance of community mental health models and of doing this work together collectively. And you don't need licensed therapists to do it. We have so many resources within our own communities that can just hold space for our grief and our rage and our pain. And I think there's so much value in creating spaces where we can be witnessed by our community in our healing journey and to know that we're not alone in it. So yes to therapy, and yes to community mental health models, and yes to bringing this work into movement spaces so that movement spaces become spaces where we can heal.
And there is now another question. I think we have time for one more, David.
One more, I think, Amy, yes.
Okay. How do we bring healing to systems that maintain injustice, such as the doctrine of discovery?
Yeah. So here's the thing. I believe that every individual in the world is capable of healing and deserve healing. I don't think every individual in the world is going to get there in their lifetime, but I do believe that we deserve it and we're capable of it. I don't know if that is the case with systems. Like the systems that perpetuate injustice may need to compost, right? And for us to create new systems, I don't, like I do restorative justice work, right? Like I am trying to create pockets of sanity within the larger criminal justice system. But I'm under no illusion that, like, I don't think the prison system can ever be transformed to become a life affirming system that actually creates safety in our communities. I think we need entirely new systems of responding to harm and responding to violence in our communities. So I don't believe that every system can be healed, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge that every single individual who is a part of those systems deserve healing and is capable of healing.
Thank you, Kazu, very much. And thank you all. Please stay in touch with Peace Action at nhpeaceaction.org. And on Facebook, learn more about what we're working on and what programming we have coming up. Kazu, this has been a wonderful talk and one that I will want to revisit, and I know that it will be part of Peace Action's archive of programs. Amy, your turn.
All right, I'm putting some things in the chat so that people can find where to follow us and where to find this and other programs that we've recorded. And let me give you a few highlights, though, about what's coming up. So particularly, I'll start with in-person things for the New Hampshire folks. So we have Ceasefire Now vigils continuing. Our next one's Wednesday, June 18th, 2 to 3 at Representative Pappas's office in Dover. The next day, Thursday, June 19th, noon to 1, folks will be at City Plaza in Concord. And then Wednesday, June 25th, 2 to 3, will be at Senator Shaheen's office in Dover on Central Ave. Also, breaking news here. Please join us for an emergency rally. No U.S. war on Iran. That's coming up this Friday, June 20th, 6 p.m. in front of the Concord State House on that sidewalk area. For more than 20 years, the peace movement has been advocating successfully to stop the U.S. from getting into a direct war with Iran. And we want to shut this one down before it gets any worse. We'll have a program of about an hour with a few speakers, some music, time to stand together and publicly call for peace. Please join us on Saturday, June 28th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. for our annual meeting featuring an update on our work, a potluck lunch with a barbecue, and a workshop that Kevin will give us on how to have difficult conversations. Our next Monday Peace and Justice conversation will be June 30th, 7 p.m. on Zoom, and this has had a change in topic. It's now going to be featuring a focus on U.S. policy in Iran and Yemen with Isaac Evans-France from Action Corps and some others. We're still putting that together, but that's what we are planning on. Our July Peace and Justice conversations will all focus on nuclear weapons, which again, here we are with another conflict we're dealing with that is frighteningly close to the possibility of nuclear weapons being used. On Monday, July 14th, 7 p.m., we have Jackie Cabasso for Nuclear Weapons in a Time of Crisis, Why Local Action Matters. And Monday, July 28th, these are in July, 7 p.m., Appreciation. It's a short film about Hibakusha, survivor of the Japan bombings, and the filmmaker will join us as well, maybe to another person who worked on it as well. Note that you can catch up on most of our past Monday night programs online on our YouTube channel. And I think I pass it back to David at this point.
Yes, thank you, Amy. This series is free and open to everyone. It would mean a lot to us to have your support. for us, for our work, and for this series in particular, especially after a challenging financial year. To donate, go to nhpeaceaction.org/donate. And Amy is putting that in that link in the chat. And with that, I will say thank you all, and especially Kazu, thank you again for a really wonderful, thought-provoking talk, and good night to everyone.
Thank you all so much.